Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the first of three videos introducing medieval literature broadly. So in this lecture, we're going to cover the first sub-period there, Old English or Anglo-Saxon literature. So let's get started. So medieval literature within the history of English literature more broadly, I like to schematize it this way, as you can see it highlighted here. And the color coding just is a way of indicating within how we teach it here at the University of Ottawa. We usually have for English majors two different courses. We introduce them to British literature. First, covering medieval and Renaissance literature up to 1700, and then one covering 1700 to the present. So medieval literature is this foundational period, really the beginning of English literature up until 1485. So it covers a vast period, over 1,000 years. And for that reason, when you're looking at medieval literature, it's good to think of it as having three sub-periods. First, the Anglo-Saxon period from 450 to 1066, with Old English being the linguistic basis, and foundational works such as The Dream of the Rood, which we'll talk about, Beowulf, of course, the great Old English epic, and The Wanderer. And then in the second subperiod, Anglo-Norman, where we have the influence of the French through the Norman invasion of the British Isles. So some works that we'll refer to there, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, the Lays of Marie de France, and then finally what could be called or is called Middle English, the last few hundred years of this period from 1200 to 1485, really the blossoming and kind of the high point of medieval English literature, at least, with works such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by poet. We don't know the identity of this poet. He's sometimes called the Gawain poet or the Pearl poet, another one of his great poems. Langland's Piers Plowman, a highly allegorical tale. Gower's Confessio Amantis, a frame narrative. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the most famous English frame narrative, and Lydgate's Troy book, a huge sprawling epic on Troy. So I have a note here in terms of another way of getting a, let's say, a more broadly Western tradition view and more of a sense of the literary theory and the philosophy of the Middle Ages. I have this set of lectures on medieval literary theory, which I invite you to see as well. So let's start with the Anglo-Saxon period. It's important to note that before English per se, we have, in terms of a historical overview, the Roman Britain period. So Rome had settled the British Isles, coexisting with the indigenous Celtic Britons and having fort settlements on the island from around 50 of the Common Era till 410, when they withdrew due to other pressures in the empire. And after they withdraw, that allows space for a wave of Germanic invaders, and this ushers in the Anglo-Saxon period. So Anglo-Saxons are these Germanic peoples migrating from Northern Europe. And with that migration, instead of, again, with the Romans, it was kind of coexistence with the Celtic peoples. The Germanic peoples pushed these Celtic inhabitants westward. So we have, as in this map, you can see Britain's pushed westward into the Wales, Cornish, Brittany, etc. Rome left somewhat of a legacy in Britain, but to some extent, not the type of legacy they left elsewhere in Europe. So, as elsewhere in Europe, an extensive network of roads, sanitation, water system, major cities established. Again, as elsewhere in Europe, we also have the establishment of Christianity on the island with the Romans. However, Christianity did not stick, so to speak. And the Anglo-Saxons came, they brought their own religion. Christianity had to be reintroduced later, and we'll talk about that. So that's unlike the rest of Europe, where Christianity was this lasting legacy of the Roman Empire. Also, the Romans did not leave a lasting linguistic imprint in England. So again, unlike the rest of Europe, where West the Western Empire ends up forming and in its withdrawal, these Romance language areas that are influenced by the as regional dialects of Latin. So beginning in the mid 5th century, various Germanic tribes are filling this vacuum left by the Roman withdrawal from the British Isles. And predominantly, we're looking at tribes that are called Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians. So we can see the Angles coming from this area of current Denmark, settling in this mid-eastern section, the English Saxon in the southeast. We have English Jutes here and somewhat here, Frisians scattered about. So the Jutes end up forming this kingdom called Kent. The Saxons formed a few kingdoms called Wessex, Sussex, and Essex. So these names endure, and basically all of them are just contractions of West Saxony, South Saxony, East Saxony. The Angles formed kingdoms in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. And it's from the Angles that we have the term England. Unlike the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons did not, as I mentioned, leave a lasting linguistic imprint. The Anglo-Saxon political hierarchy consists of a sovereign ruler, the king, responsible for law, defense, and land distribution, and his authority is both sacred and practical, often tied to lineage and divine favor. And he would have with him thanes, noble retainers who held land from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. So they ranked below earls, but above freemen and were essential to local governance. This is a picture of King Alfred the Great, early Anglo-Saxon ruler. So of note here is the land tenure component. Thanes held land by thanage, a form of conditional tenure. Their status depended on landholding, service, and reputation. Military duty, the thanes were expected to fight for the king and bring their own men in times of war. They formed the king's war band. And council and governance. So senior thanes often sat in the Witan, the king's council, advising on law and policy. Now, in works such as Beowulf or The Wanderer, and we'll talk briefly about those, the bond between the king and thane is really idealized as one of generosity from the king and loyalty on both sides and heroic duty. So there's this defining social and political relationship that forms their identity there. The king rewards thanes with treasure and honor, while the thanes defend the realm and uphold the king's name. We have a image on the right that is this mead hall, which is this major setting within Anglo-Saxon literature and culture. So it's the king's residence, it's the court, it's the site of huge communal festivities, and we see that featured prominently in Beowulf. So it's the mead hall that is under attack by Grendel, and Beowulf has to fight and kill Grendel. So Anglo-Saxon religion, as I said, came with the Anglo-Saxons. Christianity did not endure. They bring their own pagan beliefs. So they have this part of this Anglo-Saxon religious system is a firm belief in fate, which is, in the Old English word is weird for that. And we get our term weird from that. And of interest is in Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth, the witches refer to themselves as the weird sisters. They can see the future. They can see the fates. They're like the three fates in a way from Greek mythology. The Anglo-Saxons worshipped different Germanic gods. You can see a few here that end up becoming the roots of our names for days of the week. So Woden, the chief of the gods, becomes the root of the word Wednesday. Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons begins in the late 6th century with the arrival of St. Augustine, not the St. Augustine author of the Confessions, different St. Augustine, who converts King Ethelbert of Kent. With Christianity, there's brought an ethos of peace. There's written literature that is brought there, education, monks acting as scribes, writing down previous oral tales. So these oral tales, such as Beowulf, part of this oral Germanic culture. Only with Christianity are they actually recorded and brought down to us, which is part of the irony there. Also, it means understanding Anglo-Saxon literature means we have to try to understand how that forms the basis of our current language. So if we think of the history of the language, you can see it represented on the right, but basically there's three main periods. So Old English, which has this Anglo-Saxon roots, basically a evolution of various Germanic languages, and you can see the opening lines of Beowulf here, basically another language. You need to study it. There are different letters. That's thorn. The vocabulary is different. Pronunciation is different. You would need quite an education to be able to read that. Middle English. These are, and we'll see later on how this evolved, but with Middle English, and these are the opening lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it's somewhat different than modern English, but you can discern it. It's starting to get into its modern shape. So the opening lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, one that April with his showers suited, the dracht of March hath pierced to the Rute. When April with its showers sweet, the drought of March has pierced to the root. So when rain comes in April and drenches the roots of plants, then then pilgrims want to go on a pilgrimage, which is the punchline after these lines. And then modern English, of course, begins with Shakespeare. We don't normally think of Shakespeare as the way we talk now, but that's really modern English that has kind of evolved in terms of vocabulary, but the pronunciation is the same. To be or not to be, that is the question. A famous line from Hamlet, of course. So when it comes to Anglo-Saxon poetry, it's important to note that, as I mentioned, it's oral. It has an oral tradition. Now, we can think of Homer in the Greek tradition, is Iliad and the Odyssey being primarily, scholars think, having developed out of an oral tradition. And Homer may be an oral bard whose tales were somehow written down later. The Anglo-Saxon poetry is often has these caesuras, they're called. It's a pause in the middle of the line, breaking up the line, and we have alliteration and the repetition of consonant sounds uniting the two parts of the line. Another feature that brings a lot of the power to Old English poetry are these kennings, they're called, which are compound words that metaphorically describe something, such as whale road for the sea. And there are a number of these in Old English and provide, as I said, part of the poetic, metaphoric beauty of the work of thinking of the sea as a whale road. This is in a poem called The Seafarer. When it comes to literary genres, the Old English has epic, and Beowulf is a great example. Elegy, there are a number of these, and we'll talk about that again. The Wanderer being a classic example. Lyric or dream visions, which the Dream of the Rood is an example. Histories, the ecclesiastical history written by Bede. Interestingly, no drama. So the Dream of the Rood, written in the late 17th century, we're not quite sure when. Basically, the structure is the opens with a prologue from the speaker that mentions how they had had this dream vision. And in the dream vision, there's a cross, a rood, rood being a word for cross, who spoke to him. And the body of the poem, the main part of the poem, is the speech in giving this the set of the speech of the rood in three sections. So the first one describes the history of the cross. The second part, glory of the cross, having borne Christ. And then the final part is the cross, the rood's message to humankind of say the moral to take away from this tale. And then we have a short epilogue from the dreamer. So here's an excerpt from paragraphs 4 to 5 of the dream of the rood. The hero young, so the hero was Christ. He was Almighty God, did off his raiment steadfast, stout of heart, with valor, in the sight of many men. He mounted up upon the lofty gallows, when he would fain redeem mankind. I trembled when the hero clasped me, yet dared I not incline unto the ground, nor fall upon the face of earth, but I must needs stand firm. As a cross was I lifted up. I bore aloft the righteous King, the Lord of heaven. I dared not bow me down. So this is a speech of the cross, an inanimate object, obviously, and this dream vision is able to speak, talking about this experience of having borne on it Christ during the crucifixion. And we're taking this Christian story, but presenting it, as you can see already, in language that seems to echo some of these Anglo-Saxon political and social hierarchies that we just described. So the king, Christ, is this generous bringer of grace within the Christian ethos, but also kind of like the king within the political hierarchy of the Anglo-Saxons. And the cross, like a thane, is there to bear duty, to be loyal to this king. I'll just continue. They pierced me through with darksome nails. On me the scars are manifest, the open, woeful wounds. Yet dared I not work harm to any one of them. They mocked us both together. All bedewed with blood was I, gushing from the hero's side. When he had yielded up his spirit, many a dire affliction I bore upon that mount. Behold, the Lord of hosts stretched out grievously. Darkness had compassed about with clouds the body of the wielding God, that lustrous radiance. Wan under heaven shadows went forth, and all creation wept, wailing the slaughter of its king. Christ was on the cross. So what we see is this juxtaposition of a couple of models of heroism. So the poem displays sharply this tensions between the Anglo-Saxon worldview and their traditional martial ethos, a martial ethos where what is valued is bravery, victory in war, in arms, and this Christian otherworldly philosophy, which is one where heroism is pacifism, is directing one's sights to another world. So how can someone who dies disgracefully on the cross or rood be a hero for a warlike people? This is the conundrum, right? If you're a Christian trying to convert this Anglo-Saxon people, and Christianity with its ethos of peace, we could say, is a tough sell to the warriors of this Anglo-Saxon society. So the poem displays in a way a number of the ways in which Christian proselytizers tried to make Christianity amenable to warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons. So the poem shows how, even in this defeat, Christ had to portray the steadfast virtues of a warrior. To quote again, the hero young, he was Almighty God, did off his raiment, steadfast, stout of heart with valor. So there is a courage there in in Christ. This is what they need to highlight. And in the Christ-like life, the imitation of Christ that a Christian has to undertake. So this act of passively sacrificing oneself is seen as a glorious act of heroism. This glory is transferred to the cross, and the two, cross and Christ, are almost equivalent. So you can become heroic like Christ if you take on these types of burdens as well. And the ultimate message of the poem seems to be that all of us can, like the cross, become stout warriors like Christ, insofar as we become one with him or follow in his footsteps. So this is an overview of the medieval Christian framework. And I go into this in more detail. I'll put the link in the description in that introduction to medieval literary theory. But in effect, what it's highlighting here in this chart is how everything on the left-hand side is referred to, directed to, finds its meaning in the right-hand side. So the physical world finds its meaning, is directed to the spiritual. So this physical world of becoming needs to be directed to find its meaning in our eternal world. So this world of the earth in the afterworld. And our life is a pilgrimage and has as its goal the divine glory of being one with God. Now, this is, again, this dualism is quite a bit different from Anglo-Saxon ethos generally. So this had to be accommodated to them. Another work we can look at quickly is Beowulf, written in probably, again, we're not sure the exact dates. There's different speculations on this, but probably the first half of the 8th century. It's the great Old English epic poem about this Geatish warrior who travels to Denmark to defeat the monster Grendel, who's been terrorizing King Hrothgar's mead hall. So Beowulf first kills Grendel, then, in an underwater adventure, kills his mother, and finally, the final stage of the poem, 50 years later, Beowulf is an old king. He defeats a dragon in his homeland, and he is mortally wounded at the end. So this story is set in pagan Scandinavia in the 5th and 6th century. So the Geats are here in modern day Sweden. Beowulf travels to the land of the Danes to help Hrothgar, the king of the Danes, whose mead hall has been under attack by the monster Grendel for 12 years. And this story is likely transmitted orally before and oral transmitted orally to uh, current England and written down by scribes at some point in the 8th century. So this had been an oral tale transmitted for a couple hundred years until scribes in England wrote it down at some point. Once again, we see two models of heroism at work. So we have the warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons, rooted in Anglo-Saxon tradition, valuing physical strength and bravery. And Beowulf is all these things, single-handedly taking on this monster that had devoured so many, and none of the soldiers could stand up to him. And loyalty to one's lord, the pursuit of fame and glory through heroic deeds, all of that encapsulated in Beowulf. And he fights Grendel barehanded and doesn't shy away from the dragon's attack when all of his men flee. So he has this incredible reputation for strength and courage, and that's central to his legend and why it gets passed down. And then Christianity is becoming dominant in the culture that ends up writing this tale down in Anglo-Saxon Britain. So the poem's recorded there. It records the story of martial bravery, but it adds Christian flavor to it. So the poem ends up having injected into a Christian element, such as portraying Grendel as a descendant of Cain and framing Beowulf's triumphs as being due to God's will. So Hrothgar's advice to Beowulf about the dangers of pride and greed also reflect Christian teachings. Then the last work I'll look at is The Wanderer, around the end of the 10th century, 975, around that point. It's a famous Old English elegy that explores themes of loss, exile, and the search for meaning from an anonymous Anglo-Saxon poet. And the genre is a classic example of the Old English elegy, which is a poem of serious reflection, typically a lament for the dead. It also contains elements of wisdom poetry. So what is the good life? Those types of eternal question, wisdom poetry, for instance, from the Bible. We have wisdom poetry in the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition. The poem's a dramatic monologue detailing the emotional and physical journey of a solitary warrior who is in exile after the destruction of his community and the death of his lord and kinsman. So it's composed of 115 lines of alliterative verse with a caesura or pause in each line, which is typical, as I said, of Anglo-Saxon poetry. And the structure moves from this personal despair and memory to a general philosophical reflection and ultimately a contemplation of faith. So the main part of the poem is this dramatic monologue of this warrior who's alone and who's lamenting being alone and where have all these things gone? The past attachments that I have there are all gone now. And there's this sense of loss. And then there's this narrator that comes in after this speech of the warrior and injects some Christian flavor of needing to be detached from attachment to these physical things. So as an elegy, this is, I would say, a feature of Old English literature. It seems to be able to confront squarely human mortality and the transience of all things because it's less thoroughly permeated by Christianity. So it has less of a fully Christian attitude to the temporal world as and and is able to say, okay, well, these things go and let's lament that for a second, as opposed to, let's say, seeing loss of this physical world and seeing that as merely, let's say, the first step towards pointing us to something that's joyous, which is the spiritual that to which they're passing. So without that kind of Christian dualistic flavoring, Old English confronts the transience to some extent, I would say. So, for instance, the poem contains a prominent manifestation of this ubi sunt motif, literally in Latin, where are they? So ubi sunt is a later Latin term put on this device that you see in a lot of different forms of literature. So this is a passage from The Wanderer, lines 88 to 96. He who deeply considers with wise thoughts this foundation and this dark life, old in spirit, often remembers so many ancient slaughters and says these words: Where have the horses gone? Where are the riders? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Oh, the bright cup. Oh, the brave warrior. Oh, the glory of princes. How the time passed away, slipped into nightfall as if it had never been. So really this ubi sunt is, where are they now? They're gone. We seem when they were there, you're not thinking about the fact that they're so transient, and now they're gone as if they were never there because there's no lasting permanence to them in any way, in the most fundamental senses. Um, and as I said, this ubi sunt theme is prominent, and a famous passage from a much later work, Shakespeare's Hamlet, is maybe one of the more famous examples of this ubi sunt motif. In This is the scene, Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet, where he encounters these grave diggers and he finds a skull and finds it's the grave of Yorick, who used to entertain him as a child. And we have this famous speech of Hamlet: Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath bore me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment? that were wont to set the table on a roar. Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that. So we'll stop there. This has been, as I said, the first part of a three-part introduction to medieval literature. In the next part, we'll look at Anglo-Norman literature. I'll see you next time.